we have a whole range of extremely serious problems, and there's war and terrorism and environmental devastation and the different types of physical disease and psychological disease and hunger and water depletion and pollution and so forth, as well as the horrific treatment of animals for food and the loss of habitat and so forth, and the loss of genetic diversity. And what I think is happening, what I've been essentially trying to do here also, is to move our mistreatment of animals for food from simply one of our many problems and move it to the very center and say, no, it's not just one of our many problems, kind of far down on the list because they're just animals, so whatever suffering they go through really isn't all that important compared to human suffering. But instead of that, to move it to the very center of our human predicament and see it for what it actually is, which is as the driving fury that's hidden behind all of our dilemmas. Because the mentality that is required to kill, what people have been talking about here, roughly 25 million animals every single day for food. Those are land animals, probably 75 million animals every day for food if we include all animals, including those from the water. That mentality that's required to do that is precisely the mentality that is the driving force behind all of these other problems and dilemmas and the massive amount of suffering that we're creating for ourselves on this earth. Essentially, it's the mentality of the commodification of life, of reducing beings to things, of practicing with every single meal a mentality where I do not see a being as a being, I see a being merely as a piece of meat. So it's essentially a mentality of materialism, a mentality of domination and of predation, of learning to look with eyes that see how can I use others for my own benefit, a mentality of might makes right. Essentially, it's also a mentality of privilege and of elitism, because the subtext of every meal is that certain beings are inherently superior to others, and those superior beings can use those other inferior beings however they want. We eat that with every meal. That's the underlying paradigmatic message that we get as little infants as we're growing up, that the superior use the inferior, and we create cultural relationships of enormous inequality that seems to be growing in many ways. And so we see that there's this essential mentality that's required when we have most of the people in our culture contributing to this and taking out their wallets and paying for meals that require so much suffering and violence and devastation to other living beings. It's essentially a mentality of exclusion. And so what veganism is, essentially, is a mentality of radical inclusion. It's saying I am no longer going to practice, I'm no longer going to be part of a cultural practice of exclusion and domination and exploitation of others. I am going to be a revolution of one. And because I cannot actually change another person directly, I can certainly, as we've been talking about here, plant seeds, and we can learn to plant seeds more and more effectively, but I can change myself. And I think this is the great gift we can give to the world. I think there's nothing more powerful any one of us can do than to make the effort to understand the ramifications of our choices for food, and then to actually bring our lives into alignment with our values and live our values. Our planet is so beautiful. It is enormously abundant. We're growing right now enough grain to feed between 12 and 15 billion people. We only have a little less than 7 billion, and yet we have roughly 1 billion people starving. And so we can feed everyone easily if we move toward a more plant-based diet. We can reduce, as we know so clearly, the physical diseases. We can reduce the psychological diseases. We can actually create a whole other way of living. And the thing I think that we are beginning to understand gradually, and it's growing more and more, is something very essential, that all of the world's religious traditions have emphasized that there is one essential teaching, which is whatever you most want for yourself, give that to others. And this is the thing to understand with animals. they are beings whose interests are to them as important to them as my interests are to me. And if we are born into a culture where we are taught to see their interests as absolutely not mattering at all. And so as that begins to change, we begin to see that we can come into alignment with the ancient wisdom of our species and connect with the underlying wisdom and compassion that we are, and see that as we sow, we reap. Whatever we put out comes back. Food is enormously powerful, and it's the most powerful way any culture transmits its values from generation to generation is through the meals. So looking deeply into our meals is an adventure of looking deeply into our own programming and into the way we think and our aspirations and our view of the world, and changing that is actually the way to inner spiritual and psychological liberation. And so it's so interesting to look at. Just think about it a little bit. All the problems that we have, actually, I think if we look deeply, we're actually inflicting them routinely on animals for food. A lot of the physical problems we have, like, for example, obesity. Obesity is something that we force billions of animals into because they're sold by the pound. So we have special ways of confining and feeding and giving hormones to animals to make them very fat very quickly. So we're sowing massive seeds of obesity, and we get obesity ourselves. We do the same thing with osteoporosis. Dairy cows and hens have terrible osteoporosis because there's a lot of calcium in milk and eggshells, and we just force them to overproduce. So slaughterhouse workers say that they can break the bones of dairy cows in their bare hands after they have slaughtered them. So we sow osteoporosis in massive numbers of mainly female animals, and we find the same thing happening to us. And the same thing with the other problems that we're having. We force them to eat junk food. We force them to live in toxic environments. We force them to have their families destroyed and broken down, and we find, again, the same things are happening to us. So I think we need to begin to see that as we sow in our relationships with other non-human animals, we do reap in our own culture and in our own lives, and that as we give love and compassion and inclusion and kindness and respect and mercy to those beings who cannot retaliate, they cannot retaliate, but our violence towards them always retaliates. It comes back as physical disease, as psychological and cultural and environmental disease and spiritual disease. And so as we treat them with kindness and inclusion, we begin to create a foundation where peace and justice and equality and freedom are actually possible for us as human beings. And this is the great challenge of our time, and I think all of you in this room are working in ways to help that to happen. And I think this is the greatest thing we can possibly be doing. So I would just like to kind of wrap this up, and I know it's kind of the closing of our time together in the larger picture here. So I'd like to close with a short piece of music and invite all of us, as we're listening, to connect with our own sense of being a being of consciousness. That what we are is life itself. That there is a light that is always shining in our heart. It is always shining a light of loving kindness, a light of peace, a light of compassion, a light of joy, a light of harmony. Light of nurturing and protectiveness. We just open our heart and allow this web of relations. We know that we are connected with all manifestations of life, of this light, that there is one life living through all living beings. And we see all of our loved ones awakening, our colleagues and friends, the other advocates and activists that we're aware of, the growing, multiplying movement of compassion for all life, of joy and health and freedom. As we continue our efforts, that a world that is transformed is inevitable, that there is nothing that can stop the truth. There is nothing that can stop the love that is the true reality. That a vegan world is inevitable in our lives. It is already coming. We can hear it every day, coming closer and closer. It's established in consciousness. It is the truth of our being. Celebration and abundance.
I could not think of a better way to end this plenary by listening to that. That was so magnificent.